All right, so this week we're going to discuss Europe. Um, Real quickly, some administrative notes. So you have your assignment this week is an essay on the sort of forced Ukrainian famine by the Soviet Union called the Holodomor. Anyway, it provides some context to the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war currently underway. And then next week we'll talk about Russia and the Russian sphere, and then we'll have exam 2. So it's kind of a quick turnaround, and then we'll have the spring break. I'm gonna honor y'all's spring break, and we won't really have anything. We'll go dark, as they say in the theater, for a week. I'm also gonna start posting, I guess, both PowerPoints. I've posted my own, but I'm gonna post the ones from the publisher also. They're not fantastic, but they provide a lot of sort of detail, if you know, that from the book, and reference the tables and slides and all that sort of stuff. So I'll post both. Today I'm going to talk about the ones that I've made. Again, if you follow the links, there's kind of some Easter eggs in these slides. There's some links to polls and websites, and there's links to some videos. One on sort of land reclamation about the building of a deep water port near Rotterdam, and we'll talk about land reclamation when we get to places like Maldives and Singapore and Tokyo and things like that. So just keep that in mind. So this week, we'll talk a little bit about Europe. There's two, broadly speaking, there's two basic theories, I guess you could say, about all of these kinds of things. If you want them expressed, there are two sort of broad theories. One is kind of the idea that, especially European culture, is in some ways kind of an accident, a happenstance of geography, that Europe is uniquely situated with plenty of deep water ports and peninsulas, and England as an island providing it protection and all that, and tends to downplay culture. That's the sort of guns, germs, and steel idea from Jared Diamond's book. The other one is more cultural based, and it's not really a geography book, but there's a book called Carnage and Culture by Victor Davis Hanson, who's a military historian, and his book sort of takes the contra view of Diamond, that it's not just geography, not that geography doesn't have a say and have an influence, of course, in how world events unfold, but that it's more sort of culture. I mean, his book is more about sort of the so-called Western way of war, and he looks at key battles when Western cultures have gone against non-Western cultures, and sort of what the cultural components are that sort of lead to victory in those battles. And anyway, it kind of takes a different view of culture than Jared Diamond's view. If you are interested in those kinds of books, I don't know if you have a lot of time to read while the semester's on, but down the road, both books are good books, I think. And so, the European sphere is going to be marked by a couple of demographic things. One is it has a very much a declining population. I guess you could say indigenous population. The birth rates across the industrialized world are cratering in some places, especially when we get to Russia, Japan, China, even in the United States, we're below replacement rate. And so there is going to be a probably, if given history, a great migration of peoples around the world again as they move into places that were previously, I mean, most of that will be beyond our lifetimes, I think, unless something just really catastrophic happens in terms of like an environmental disaster or a war or something along those lines. But when you hear people talk about birth rates and declining birth rates, that's a legitimate concern for many cultures, especially given our governmental systems based on labor and tax payments and government largesse, the welfare state from the 19th century and things like that. In terms of culture, I'm going to talk mostly about a little bit about the so-called modernizing revolutions. Most of they start in Western Europe, and not solely, but mostly, and then they spread. We've already talked about colonialism 1.0. We're going to talk about colonialism 2.0, and of course, with China, there may be a new version of colonialism at at play. Like a lot of things, there are lots of bad things, and there are some good things, I guess you could say, or some silver linings to these clouds. And one of them is the spreading around of these ideas and techniques and technologies and things like that. So, first one here, the agrarian revolution leads to the bumper crops, if you will, especially since the 17th or 18th century. So we won't hit too much on the constitutional issues of private ownership of land and property rights, but suffice it to say, is feudalism sort of leaves the landscape in Europe and leaves the landscape in other parts of the world. Those farmers, first in a mercantile economy, later in a capitalist economy, and later on in a sort of regulated, moderated capitalist economy, start to grow more food, and then they have surplus. So instead of subsistence farming, they have more food to take to market, and of course looking for markets, put them on ships and head around the world, doing bad things and some good things. Better techniques, crop rotation, pest control, hybridizing of drought resistant, famine, heat resistant, winter resistant strains of wheat and grain and farm and vegetables and those kinds of things. Then the resulting growth in population, which also creates more markets, which creates more money, which creates more need for food, which creates more. The Industrial Revolution will exacerbate the move to the cities, which is what urbanization is, of course. So the last century, we'll see urban populations skyrocketing and rural populations cratering, as farming in some parts of the world is more, technologized. I think I just made up a word there. In the Industrial Revolution, right, obviously we get factories, the steam engine, the need for coal and shipping, a revolution in shipping, where we go from the age of sail to the age of coal to the age of diesel and to nuclear age. Again, a continuing population boom, and then the need for sort of the use of colonialism, I should say, rather, in the search for markets. And this is language I don't really use today. If you ever read the book The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt, Arendt, great description of fascism and Soviet communism as they grow and sort of totalize their populations. In there, she has a discussion about this sort of 19th century colonial / imperialism and the need for what they called back then anyway, surplus men, meaning there's not enough jobs, not enough resources, there's too many men, because men dominated the workplace back then. Today would probably too many people to sort of satisfy or satiate, and so they go off into the various and sundry places around the world, mostly, as we'll talk about later, in sub-Saharan Africa. So if you think about the Belgian Congo, the Congo Free State, you have some Belgians in Belgium who are looking to get rich. They're looking for markets. They're looking for opportunity. And you throw on top of that the sort of scientific racism of the day, and you got yourself a very bad cocktail that will lead to some very bad outcomes, as we'll talk about. And then the third one is the political revolutions, which lead to democracy. So sort of the American Revolution or the War of Independence. There's the French Revolution in 1789 and going forward. There's the Haitian Revolution, also in the New World. There's the Bolivarian revolutions, which we've already talked about a little bit. Revolution is in the air, right? And so the French, of course, leads to Napoleon and all of that. Well, less said, the better for now. And then that, of course, reverts back to a monarchy. And then in the mid-19th century, there's a series of revolutions that lead to sort of the liberation, classical liberalism. And then you get sort of offshoots of that. You get socialism, which is, broadly speaking, the government controls the means of production. You get more extreme versions and less extreme versions of that, of course. Nationalism, which of course is this idea of, and as we mentioned before, all the lines on the maps are basically legal documents. They don't necessarily reflect a reality on the ground, right? So As we'll see when we get to Eastern Europe, the Ukrainians, there are Ruthenians and Ukrainians and Russians. They just drew the lines on the map sort of willy-nilly to meet various and sundry interests, especially back in 1920 or whenever. And oftentimes the lines on the map do not coincide with the reality on the ground. We'll talk more about that. The extremes of those then lead, of course, in the 20th century to communism, fascism, totalitarianism, unrestrained capitalism, we could argue in some places as well. And then the sort of liberal democracies that we see mostly in Europe still, or most European countries, of course, are liberal democracies. And then the authors talk a lot about what they call centrifugal and centripetal forces. And this is not new or only them. Centrifugal forces are those things that create division in a population. So if you think about religion, especially in the last millennium, the religious wars, Protestantism and Catholicism and the Protestant Revolution, the Great Schism between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, obviously the Crusades and those kinds of things, and you throw in those people groups within countries, ethnic rivalries, tribal rivalries. One of the problems in the United States by seeing everything in terms of black, white, brown, skin color, is it really does a disservice to the study of these things, because Europe is not white, whatever that means. Europe is intensely tribal. There is no European identity to speak of, or they're trying to create one, of course, with the European Union. But if you go to Scotland and you call them Irish, you might get a punch. If you call them English, you might get a punch. If you call an Englishman a Scotsman or a Welshman, you might get a punch in the face also, et cetera, et cetera. So intensely tribal, ethnically divided in some cases. Even little Belgium doesn't get along between the Flemish and the Walloons in Wallonia. In Belgium, it's split into two. So there are centrifugal forces all across Europe that are, in some cases, divide. There are, of course, centripetal forces that try to unite. So the European Union is an attempt at that. So is the euro, the trying to have a common dollar. They're probably united in some ways against, it sounds like, let's just say the speech by Vance in Munich the other day, though whether that's a uniting force for a long time, who knows. They might be united economically. They might be united against Russia. They might be united in favor of X, Y, or Z. Those are called centripetal forces. They bind people together, right? They discuss these in the European chapter, but you see these all over countries and nations around the world. Of course, there's a universal aspect to that there. That's on slide 6, 7, 8, and 9 in my packet of slides that I made, which are adapted, of course, from the slides from the book. And then I've added stuff in as well. On slide 15, I provide some of those centrifugal forces. So Ukraine, Russia scenario, of course, has divided some countries. Economics, of course, this whole issue of tariffs, which is really just kind of new on the scene. But there were trade agreements when the British left in the Brexit. It is a big issue still of how are they going to handle trade and commercial transactions and those kinds of things. Nationalism, there are still movements. The Catalans in Spain trying to separate. You've got, as I said, they've kind of died down a little bit, but the Flemish and the Walloons in Belgium don't get along. There was talk of a decade or so about Belgium maybe splitting into two. Belgium is kind of a Frankenstein's monster of two people groups sort of wedged together in the 1830s. Maybe Frankenstein's monster is not the most gracious picture. You've got Scottish independence, or trying to separate. You've got Northern Ireland and Ireland, all those kinds of things. Kind of buried underneath all the news. Terrorism question is kind of bubbling like it has anywhere else. There was an Islamic terrorist attack recently. The IRA, the Irish Republican Army, has kind of died down in recent years. The Basques, a group called the ETA, near Barcelona and the northern parts of Spain, and other groups can sometimes play a centrifugal part in dividing populations. And then really the last one here in terms of discussion. All the pictures in Germany are, like I said, are pictures my wife took. Pictures in Belgium. If you go to slide 29, there's the video depiction of land reclamation. It's a sped up time lapse satellite image of the dredging out and building of a port for Rotterdam in Great Britain, or excuse me, in Netherlands. You can see a picture of it there on slide 30. The Eastern Europe, I wanted to deal with Eastern Europe a little bit. We'll deal with Russia, Ukraine next week when we get to Russia. But so there's a couple of videos there. One on World War II in Warsaw. Slide 40, you'll get a picture of sort of the destruction of Warsaw in World War II. Basically, the Nazis and the Soviets, Warsaw started out with maybe 1 million people in 1939. It was down to like 1,000 people in 1945 by the end of World War II. And then the second clip there is a clip of the sort of Warsaw Remembrance Day about the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. So if you want to know why the Poles always sort of feel caught betwixt and between Germans and Russians, we don't have the opportunity in this class to go deep into that issue, but suffice it to say, they've been in the middle of more than a few conflicts, and Poland has disappeared and reappeared and disappeared and reappeared multiple times, and they are fiercely resistant to some of that. So when Russia invades Ukraine, the Polish antenna go way up. Their spidey sense tingles at the highest level possible on that. And then the last one here on slide 42, I wanted to hit these terms. So if you hear this term kind of generally. So Balkanization refers to the sort of southeastern European area, the Balkan Peninsula, the Balkan Mountains. Balkanization refers to breaking up into smaller hostile units. So that term comes from this area. So if you go into this area here in this part of Europe, the history of it is fascinating. You have an intersection of Islam, Orthodoxy, and Christianity. Really, there's a book I read years ago called Sailing to Byzantium, which is a takeoff on a Yeats poem title, and it's about I cannot remember the author's name off the top of my head now. First name is Simon. And it's a fascinating history about this region from the influx of Islam and the split between the Russian or the Orthodox rather and the Catholic Church, and its play in this region, in all the wars and conflicts and things like that. We also get the term ethnic cleansing from this area. So well before there was World War II and the Holocaust and all that, and even a few years before the Turkish genocide in Armenia of Armenians, you get ethnic cleansing there. Even before that, you had this idea of eradicating people groups either by forced migration, outright murder, and all those kinds of things. So the concept doesn't come from this region, but the term does, right? So, we see ethnic cleansing all throughout history. You've got the Jewish diaspora by the Romans. You've got the Trail of Tears by the American government, moving the Cherokee and the Creek and others from Mississippi to Oklahoma Territory. It's not a new concept, of course, but the sort of legal definition comes out of this region also in there. So I forgot to label these pictures on slide 42. So number one there is the Parthenon from a place in Athens called Mars Hill. Mars Hill was a place it's mentioned in the New Testament where St. Paul, the Apostle Paul, preaches a sermon to the philosophers. Anyway, all that to say, when he's giving that speech, that sermon, he's looking at the Parthenon up there. Parthenon's awesome. Go to the Parthenon. The middle one there is the original Olympic Stadium. You can walk out into the Olympic Stadium in Olympia, Greece. And then the bottom one there is island of Mykonos in the Aegean, which is blue paint. Anyway, so as I said, all photographs by my wife. Anyway, those are very briefly just some of the context to some of the slides that you're seeing in there. So anyway, y'all have a good week. And if you get a chance to travel, I highly recommend Greece. Very nice, amazing for a variety of reasons. Aesthetic beauty, philosophical. If you're into the New Testament, there's some things there for you also. You've got the Hot Gates, Spartans, Athenians, Thebans, Corinthians. It's amazing. Anyway, so y'all have a good week. I'll talk to y'all later.